video like everybody else. Good morning. Good morning, Sarah. Hey, how's everybody doing? Oh, we're great. It's amazing. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. So today, I am going to teach you all how to make bandsaw boxes. Yay, bandsaw boxes. Quite simply put, a bandsaw box is a box that is created by cutting a solid block of wood apart in a particular order so that you can hollow it out and then glue it back together again so that it acts like that same solid piece of wood. Usually this is done on the bandsaw, hence the name, Bandsaw Box. And what it's going to do is allow you to apply all of those principles that you have sort of been coming to understand about wood's properties, you know, in a fairly straightforward project. It's also going to introduce you to a number of hand tools. You're going to be able to carve and sculpt and do any number of things to these objects as you're making them. One thing that you should be aware of if you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to Google bandsaw boxes and see what people do. Most of the stuff that you're going to see on an image search is not very good. It's, I don't mean this as a pejorative exactly, but it's grandpa art. It's the kind of thing that your grandpa would be like, I've got all these logs and I need to turn them into something useful. And then they make bandsaw boxes. And that's all very well and good, but this is not your grandpa's wood shop. This is, you know, a college level art course. So just bear that in mind. You can go ahead and look at them for inspiration about process. If you can start to envision how these things are made and sort of reverse engineer them if you're looking at them online, that has value. But truly, very few of them that you're going to see online have any real aesthetic punch. So, for what that's worth. I have brought in an example made by my dear friend Jenna Goldberg. It is made out of a piece of scrap basswood. And it has been painted and carved. The little bits on the inside that are kind of image-based here are done with photo transfer with gel medium. And you can see how this actually takes advantage too of that bandsaw texture, right? One of the things that people do frequently when they are initially designing these objects is they forget that the bandsaw has kind of an organic path, right? It's not a super, super accurate line. So it helps if you're taking advantage of the natural qualities that the bandsaw leaves behind when you're doing your designing. Another thing to note would be that the colors on the inside, that is some clean breaks between color planes, right? It doesn't look like the yellow is bleeding over onto the blue or anything like that. That's because she painted the inside separately before she put it back together again. And just to point that out to our camera friends, this is what I'm talking about. That color distinction between planes. I'm going to pause for a second and keep going. We don't need it. Sure we don't. So how does one create something like this? The answer is very simple in many ways. There's two big rules you have to remember, and that they are, the biggest one for bandsaw box is that you are always working from the inside of the box to the outside of the box. Inside to outside. Say it with me. Inside to outside. Say it again, louder. Inside to outside. I'm not even kidding. If I could tattoo it on my eyelids, I would. Sorry, Autumn. Oh, there we go. Well, what does that mean? That means that this box started as a square or as something that was more rectilinear than this final shape is. This has curves, right? The first thing that she did when she was making this was not cut out the outside profile. The first thing she did was define this interior space. While all of her sides were still square and everything was still easily manipulable and easy to put clamps on. If you do not approach this from that inside to outside process, you can really screw yourself over, both in terms of safety and in terms of end product. And I'll explain that when we get into the machine room. The other big thing to remember are those gluing rules, right? That you can glue face grain to face grain, edge grain to face grain, edge grain to edge grain, but you cannot glue end grain to end grain. So if you cut this apart in the wrong order, or if you've got the piece of wood in the wrong orientation when you're starting to plan out your cuts, it really can be a problem. You can actually cut it apart in a way that it's not going to viably glue back together again at all. So, there are 3 handouts up here that you can use for the moment until I find the others, because, yeah. Everyone should have one of these, though. Your assignment, incidentally, due a week from today, is to make a sample box that follows these instructions exactly. Do not vary from these instructions. Don't add anything. Don't say, but wouldn't it make sense if I did? No, it wouldn't. It makes sense to follow the instructions to the letter. You will be graded on your end product and your ability to follow the instructions, which I realize I'm being a bit dramatic about, but seriously, what you're going to do is you're going to have the opportunity to mess up. You're going to have the opportunity to make every mistake that you could possibly make with your sample. And then once you've done making those potential mistakes, it's going to show you all of the difficulties in that process. And then when you go to make your real thing, your awesome project, you will have that experience of a sample box sitting there to remind you of what to do and what not to do. I will make sure that you have these, though, by the end of the day, okay? If I don't have them for you by the end of class, I'll make sure that they're here and available for you to take, so that when you do want to come in and start working on this, you have this to follow. I find it's very helpful to cross off the step as you go so that you don't lose track. Like, just read the whole thing. It's there for you. It's a beautiful thing. So before we actually do the process, I'm going to walk you through it a la diagram. We're slightly visually impaired to follow along. Does anyone else want one to follow along with right at the moment? I got one more to go. Anybody? All right. Good call. So, I am going to draw this in kind of one perspective here. So you're going to start with a block, right? Because of the nature of what we're doing here, you do really have to start with something that is at the very least 8/4, if not more than that. If you're trying to make a bandsaw box out of a 4/4 board, there's like no, why are you trying to hollow out a 4/4 board? You know what I'm saying? Like, it would be a little shallow tray. And I suppose you could do that, but it doesn't serve a lot of purpose. I'm going to encourage you guys for your samples to work with 12/4 poplar. They come in bigger blanks in terms of like usability. It would be really kind of hard to do a sample box out of the full thing. But if you guys buy the correct length, you can split it down the middle with the grain so that you can still mill it and everything. And then one person can take one and whatever. You can just split it. It's fine. Just record it as half the width of what the board is, measured at in the wood room. Make sense? Cool. So here's my board. This is always going to be the end grain. And this is always going to be face grain here. As I continue to draw this as it's getting cut apart, be aware I am not changing the orientation of this ever in my diagram, unless I'm telling you very specifically. This is how it's going to begin and how it's going to end. So of course you're going to want to begin by milling your board. Join one surface, plane parallel, join one edge. For this, you can actually join both sides, because it's not super critical that they be parallel to each other. It is pretty critical that they're 90 degrees to the top and the bottom, though. That's going to become clear very quickly when we get in there and start cutting it apart. But you got to start with something that's going to sit really nicely on the bandsaw and not want to rock at all. So go ahead and clean all four sides. If you want to flip it on its edge and run it through the planer, if it's an 8/4 board or wider, you can do that. I think that there's an 8-inch maximum depth on the planer, but whatever. Just make sure that it's flat and 90 degrees to its adjacent sides, okay? This is one of those situations too where you don't have to necessarily do 2 millings. The reason being that you're about to cut it apart. And when you cut it apart, all of those individual pieces are going to be like, woo, yeah, I'm doing my thing. And frankly, we're not going to mill those individual parts. It makes more sense to cut everything apart, put it back together again, and then if the final product needs flattening in some variety, some way or another, that we do it like that. So you don't have to do 2 millings for this. You can do 1 milling, get it all flat, get it all workable, and it'll be just fine, okay? Once I get my board and it is nice and milled, the first thing you're going to want to do is label, L-A-B-E-L, label the ever-loving crap out of it. Legit. You're going to label the top, and it says top. You are going to make varying marks on either end of the board to differentiate between either end of the board. I typically do diagonal lines. If I've got another end on the other side there, which I do, of course, if it's painted, for example, it's the end of the board, I still will do something to indicate kind of how they go together. And it'll be different than these lines. It will all make sense later. I label the bottom. I label it with bottom. Surprise, surprise. On either side, I make a series of lines that are of differing number or spacing from one side to the next, and I put arrows along those lines indicating the top. You may think to yourself, well, that's unnecessary. No, it's not. Trust me, as you are cutting this thing apart, and it starts to exist in more and more pieces, the amount of time you're going to spend trying to figure out how those pieces go back together again is a giant waste. Also, when you're actually gluing it together, if you confuse the orientation of your parts, they're not actually going to fit the way you want them to. So this helps you keep all of that straight, every last bit of it. So I put multiple arrows here so that as I'm slicing it apart into its various layers, I always have an arrow in that layer, top, middle, bottom, to differentiate again which is which. So step 1, label the crap out of it. Oh my goodness. Once the crap has been labeled out of it, you are going to begin, in terms of cutting, by cutting off the top and the bottom. So, cut off the top and the bottom. So step 1, label. Label everything. 2, cut off the top and bottom. This is with the grain. You are not cutting across the grain yet. And if you mess this step up, then that sucks. Now you may ask yourself, what thickness are we talking about here? And it's a little hard to say because these things exist as a proportion, right? You could say it shouldn't be any less than X amount, it shouldn't be any more than Y amount, but that is entirely contingent on the size of the piece of wood that you're starting with, right? The smaller the piece of wood, the smaller those tolerances can be, you know, whatever. With that said, I really like to keep, you can make the bottom a little thinner. I like to keep it between 1/4 and 3/8 depending on the species of wood. Because one of the things is that when you cut off something that thin, it's going to want to pull away really badly from its base block, right? It's going to be like, ooh, hey, look at me, I cupped like a mofo. But because you're going to be gluing it back onto this like parent block, you can kind of force it back into flat and it's not a big deal. But if you do that with the lid is free and can move and do whatever. And so if you cut a really, really, really thin lid, you can have a problem because when it goes to sit back down on the box, it might be like, no, I'm good. I'm just going to sit here with my arms up and I'm not going to like touch the sides at all. So I tend to make the top a little bit thicker, 1/2 inch minimum, sometimes even more than that. You also want to remember that you're probably going to be doing a fair bit of external shaping to this. And if you cut all that stuff too small to begin with, you got nowhere to go. So just like with the joining and the planing, you're starting with a thicker piece of wood and you're working it down so that it's a little bit thinner, right? You're losing material as you refine it. That is what this is as well. You're going to start with something much larger and it's going to slowly but surely kind of work its way down to a smaller final product. So you don't want to start right at what you want the end point to be. You want to give yourself extra so you can work to that point. That's really important. Does that make sense to everybody, how that works? Questions so far at all? I wouldn't blame you if you did. Oh, it's so good. So you know, yeah. You're a miracle worker. Woo, all right. Coffee. Yes. One of the things that you can also do with, well, let me back up. Sorry. So like, for example, the lid of this box is extremely thin. I would never do one like this if I were working with the material that you guys are going to be working with. This box is made out of basswood, which we do have, but it's made from a piece that had been sitting around as scrap for a long time. And it was already really flat, and it was already all the things that it needed to be. And when Jen cut it, it didn't want to move because it was from a block that had already been like subdivided, if that makes any sense. Plus, she can get away with it just a little bit because it has this flange on the inside that it's getting glued back to, which helps hold it flat as well. And this big old handle on top, which is doing the same thing. You can kind of sandwich those thin pieces together to help keep them immobile. That's why it's working for this one. That's probably more information than you need, but. So when you're doing a top, give yourself some extra. And if you want to, you can put a little jog in that cut. So instead of straight across, if you want your box to reference a little bit better from end to end, you can put just a little variation in that as you go, so that the lid of the box isn't going to want to slide front to back. Does that make sense? It'll make way more sense when I show you, when we do this together. So now I've got that center section. That's what you're seeing. No? Okay. I like doing this with different colored chalk so you can understand all of the steps. So here's that center section. I've taken this little chunk, I've brought it down here, right? The next step is that you're going to cut off the sides, the long sides that are also with the grain. So, step 2, cut off sides. Again, with the grain. You're going to make these 2 sets of cuts before you ever cut across the grain. So, that looks, like that. So now I've got a side and a middle and a side. In terms of thickness for that, I like to leave those fairly hefty as well. I'm going to say start by leaving them about 3/4. Because again, you can always work those walls thinner. That's pretty easy to do. Because I'm a math teacher, with a little approximate sign, I love it. Yeah. You can ultimately, eventually work those sides much, much thinner. But don't start that way, please. So those are the 2 cuts that you make with the grain. The next thing you're going to want to do is cut off the ends of the box, which, anatomically speaking, on this box would be this piece and that piece. This one and that one. Side, side, and end. Alright, so this is the first cut that is actually across the grain, right? So take that little dude. Yes. You're going to cut off your ends. So when you cut off your ends, you need to make them much larger than the sidewall thickness. This is for a couple of different reasons. So let's say that this ends up being more like 1.5 inches, something in that area, if not even bigger. If I don't have enough material, here, this will be a quick aside drawing that I'll erase in a second. If I'm trying to glue my box back together again, and I've got my 2 walls on either side here, and my ends that go in between, if they're really narrow like this, when I start to put clamping pressure on this, the whole thing is going to collapse. It'll go from this to that. You know, here's my walls, and it'll just boom. Really, really easy for the whole thing to go out of square very fast. That's reason number 1. Way more important is that wood moves. What? You don't say. Wood moves. Depending on the thickness of the walls compared to this, remember, this is all short grain, right? And this isn't. And neither is the bottom. What can happen is if you get that too thin, the strength of the wood movement in the rest of it can literally crack the whole thing apart. It can just be like, and you'll end up with a big old crack in the middle of the end there, because that grain's just not very substantial. So if you want to keep the whole thing together solidly, you make those end pieces big enough that they're able to counteract the effect of the pulling, of that right there. Make sense? So, that's the basic idea there. Make these guys huge. Because remember too, you can always make them smaller at the end. We're going to shape down that end product a lot. So, anyway, good 1.5, something like that. All right, so now I'm left with this middle section, which looks, something like that. From here, have two variables that I can play with. I can start by cutting off the flange for the lid. The flange is that little piece that's glued to the underside of that lid that's keeping it referenced to the interior. Well, this block is a perfect, cutout of that interior, so why not? So I can cut off the 1/4 inch flange. And I also want to kind of reiterate here too that I'm labeling this as I go. I will show you guys that as we're actually creating one. But it's pretty important. I'm going to label the top of this guy with glue because it's going to get glued to my lid. These all have little reference marks across them so that I end up being able to see what's what as I'm cutting them apart. I know which end is which. The other thing then, once you cut off the flange, is that this block can be used to make those little dividers if you want to. It has some function. So if you look here, the flange, which has all the pictures on it, and this came out of exactly the same block, right? So I know it'll fit because it came out of all the same block in the first place. It's amazing, right? The same idea too, the dividers on the area that has more, where it's short grain, they're a little bit blockier than where it is like along the length of the grain there. Right? So good. All right, everybody got it? You don't have to do that though. You don't have to put little dividers in. That is optional. It's in the handout as being optional. It's not a big deal. Once you've got everything cut apart like that, you got to kind of defuzz everything with a little bit of sandpaper to make sure it's going to go back together again properly. We glue it back together. We cut out the outside. That is wildly overgeneralizing. But at this point, it makes more sense to show you what I'm going to do as opposed to just talk about it. So I'm going to mill a board. You don't need to watch me mill a board. It's just a thing. Well, I'll bring you with me anyway. All right, so as I was saying, I would suggest using 12/4 poplar. It's the only 12/4 wood we've got. It's a really manageable set of dimensions. Easy to use on the bandsaw. Easy to get a good hollow out of something without having to really struggle. The stuff that we have is over yonder though. And you can see on average it's like 7 to 8 inches wide. That's not something that you guys want to have to contend with. So as I was saying, this is what students were doing last semester, is taking what was normally something twice this big, taking a good length of it and then bandsawing it down the center along its length, and then each person got one of these. From this, if you wanted to make 2 different boxes, you could. You could cut it this way, but only after you mill it. Remember, what's the minimum length for milling your lumber? Very good, 12 inches. This looks like, I think it's about 14. I'm going to measure it in a second so I can put it in the book. That's a decent amount, that's fine. But I'm not going to cut it this way and then say to myself, I'm going to mill it. This happens every semester. Every semester, somebody comes around, takes one of these, cuts it at 14, and then promptly cuts it in half across the grain. So it's completely unusable. Please don't do that. It's pretty simple. All right, weirdos. Not you. Here we go, class supplies. Sarah Martin, come on. here on 2-4. I've got P 12.18, 13 in length. I'm going to call it 4.5 in width, even though it's probably a little smaller than that. And its thickness is, of course, 12/4. So this is what I'm going to start with. Hooray! Awesome. This is a really great size board. And I'm going to mill it. And I'm going to mill it on at least 3 sides, maybe 4. The reason I'm saying that is because this is really punky. That's, believe it or not, that's a technical term. This sort of spongy wood right here is usually described as being kind of funky. So I might cut that off. I might cut this down. That probably will be what I do. So I'm going to go ahead and mill all 4 sides and then probably cut this shorter after I'm done just cutting that area out. So if you can see it here, I'll cut from probably about there after I mill it. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mill this. You are all familiar with that process at this point. So because this area is damaged as much as it is, I'm just trying to assess what's going to be the smarter way to do this to keep it from being further damaged as I'm milling it. If this ends up being on top and the planer takes too much of a chunk out of it, it can be a problem. I still think I'm going to join this side though. It's the cup side. I'll make it work. Here we go. Now on something like this that is much, much narrower, very obviously my push stick doesn't comfortably fit on side by side. I will still hold a separate push stick. I like my right and left hands to act independently of one another as I'm milling. So even though I could, in theory, do one of those, I think it's safer to just sort of like hold this one on top like that. So. That, and it's really important that it actually be 90 degrees, not just flat. So I'm going to double check my fence, and I'm going to double check my cut as I go, okay? Of course, if the fence isn't square in the first place, I'm going to have a problem. So remember, combo square, as close to the cutter head as you can get, double checking the fence, and it looks great. So that should be 90, ready to go. Because the width and the thickness are so close to one another, I'm not going to bother adjusting the fence. It's so close. It's fine. And I'm going to go ahead slightly against the grain, but again, remember, I'm going to spend a lot of time refining the outside, so it tears out a bit, not the end of the world. The more important thing is that it's flat and 90. Other side, I'm going to check for 90. Remember, when you're holding your combination square, hold it by the handle, not by the blade. Put that up to your other reference side, and then just lightly pull down. It appears to be slightly off, but I think it drifted as I was cutting. And I rectified that on the last pass that I made. I'm going to make one more pass and see if it doesn't flatten it all the way across. I think it was an operator error. So I've got a board that is flat on three sides, with the three sides 90 degrees to one another, but the two opposing sides not necessarily parallel. But that's okay. Again, it doesn't need to be at this point. So I'm just gonna clean these off. We'll go over to the planer. We'll make it flat on the planer. All right, here is my block now. Isn't it pretty? Sure, yes, absolutely, it's so pretty. So as I said, the very first thing I'm gonna do before I do anything else is I'm gonna label the ever-loving crap out of it, right? Before that, I do also maybe wanna decide what's gonna be what. Like, what's my top, what's my bottom? I could do this box very easily in this orientation or that orientation. So if I wanted it to be taller than deep, that's perfectly legit. What do you guys think? What should I do? You want to do tall? Anybody? Any votes for? You know what? I am actually going to do it like this because this is, or I'm going to do it so that this is the top and the bottom because I want to show you something. But thank you for your input. I would not normally label this with a marker. I'm doing this for visibility's sake for you guys. You really only ever want to write on your wood with a pencil. I mean, not even with a pen, just a pencil. So, pretend this is a pencil that marks really darkly. So, top. Unmistakably top. Bottom. Unmistakably bottom, right? Not going to confuse that for the top when you look at it. I'm going to mark up my ends. So even though this one has numbers on it already from those marks, I'm going to make it so that these diagonal lines go across the growth rings. See that? They're running in opposition to the growth rings. And the ones that I do on this side, I'm going to make it so that they run with. That's going to be my distinction between the ends. And I feel like that one works pretty well, actually. Like, you can tell if the line is cutting across or if it's going with. For the sides, remember what I said? You want to put a series of lines that have arrows pointing towards the top. So I've got 4 on this one. Admittedly, I have this thing here, which is going to help indicate what's going on that way too. But still, I'm going to do 3 that are spaced way further out. Remember, in general, more lines is better than less. So here is the initial set of markings on my box. I'm going to keep adding markings as I go, as I reduce this into its, subsidiary parts. So, like I said, first thing I want to do is cut off the top and the bottom. Cutting off the bottom is pretty straightforward. It's a nice straight line, unless you want the interior of the box to have a specific shape, which you can do with this. I usually leave it a nice flat thing. So I'm going to make a line here for myself that's just shy of 1/2 inch. Looks like it's about, it's like, I could be more specific than 3/8, but it's about 3/8. And it's raining again. Good Lord. All right, so that's the bottom right there. For my top, I'm going to go thicker than that. I'm going to do about 3/4, and I am probably just going to put a tiny little jog in there, like I was saying, so that it wants to reference itself front to back. I could draw that in, or I could just sort of let it happen organically. I'm going to start by drawing in a baseline, and then just vary it a little. We'll see what happens. All right, so to cut this out, it would be better served if I do it on the big bandsaw. Remember what I was talking about with this guy? The taller the cut, for one thing, the straighter the cut, all of that stuff. It's solid wood, it's not a problem. So it's just going to be way safer and better if I do it on this guy. But I haven't talked to you guys about this bandsaw yet, so that's what we're going to do now. All right, so this is Big Betty. If you guys can't see, please come around, because you're going to have to see a lot of detail on this guy. Big Betty is a beauty, aren't you? Yes, you are. Big Betty is also super temperamental. Super, super, super. It works very much the same as the little guy. Very, very much so. With one major exception. And that is the guides. Very sadly, this bandsaw, the guides don't run parallel to the blade. The guide runs like slightly off angle. So I'm going to show you, I'll show you what I'm talking about. In order to raise and lower the guard here, incidentally, you loosen this one. And the nice thing is it's counterweighted. And so I'm able to, it's not going to drop when I loosen it up. But I'm going to show you what I'm talking about in terms of the guides not really being parallel. I'm going to start by backing off, come on you, the side guides here, all the way. Let's see, can you see that? Yes, you can. So these side guides here are at an angle to the blade, right? And you can see there's a little less space on the right than there is on the left. When I go to raise this all the way up, there's now a little less space on the left than there is on the right. It does not run parallel. This is really important because what it means is that you have to readjust your side guides literally every time you change the height of the guard. Literally. If you don't, you're going to get a really crappy cut and you're going to wear out our blade really fast. So just like with the other one, when you come up to it, first thing you do is you open the dust gate. It's down here. There it is. And then the second thing you're going to do is adjust your guard. So put your board right underneath here. Same idea. You're going to bring it down until it's about a finger's height above the highest point. So not bad. I'm going to lower it just a little further. And make sure before you adjust those guides on either side that it is locked, because it's going to change position when you lock it down. And all the work that you've done setting those guides will be for naught. So what you're going to look for here is you're going to make sure that the thrust bearing is keeping it, of course, so that the teeth are in front of the guides, right? So you're not dulling the crap out of it. And you are going to slowly loosen and then move the guides to the point that they're just barely not touching the side of the blade. Just barely. Just barely. Usually what I'll do, why don't you guys come around closer? Like, you guys are probably okay. Come right back here. You'll be able to see better. Come. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the front and the back here so that you're able to keep it from sliding. Because look, when I loosen this, it falls, right? So what I want to do is I want to keep it from just slamming into the blade. So I hold it like that, I loosen it up, and then I move it down until it is just not touching the blade. And I do mean like just. You get it as close as you can without touching. And then you tighten that back up. And then I let it go. And then I do the other side, same thing. It's a little awkward, but that's all right. And tighten. The Allen wrench for this lives here. This little red set just lives right there. So if you ever see it and think to yourself, gosh, someone didn't put their tools away. Yes, they did. It lives there. It's at home. So that looks really pretty good. It's super close. It might even be touching. The way that I determine that it's not is that I then open the top and I turn my wheel. And do you see how it's able to bounce back like that? That is what I want. I'm not hearing it rub. I'm not seeing it bind. That's perfect. If it were incorrect. Let me show you what that looks like. Just gonna move that one way over for a second. You hear that? See how it stops dead? That is what's incorrect. You don't want to leave them too far out though either. If they are like really allowing the blade to twist like this, the likelihood of damage to the blade is a hell of a lot higher. And as is the likelihood that your cut's going to drift off of what you've got like sitting here. So there we go. That other sound that you're hearing is not a problem. All right, so I'm pretty much ready to go with my cut. I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut just like this. Because this is as narrow as it is, I will be making sure that I move my hand to the back, but it's also a good idea to have a push stick just in case. So I am going to grab one of my cutoffs from yesterday. I'm checking people out. And if I need to, I can use it to complete the cut on the side where there's significantly less material. I'm going to do the bottom first. Okay, so just get in there, really put your weight on it, and then it'll come to a stop. The brake is down here, so if you're interested in the mechanics of it, you can open up the bottom and take a look. You may have noticed that it kind of lurched a little bit as I was going. It was like pop, 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 pop. That has to do with a couple of things. One, this is not a brand new blade. This blade has a little tiny kink in it, and I can tell that because of the cut pattern on here. But that's not super important. The main reason that it does that is this right here. Do you see how there's sawdust right there on that surface? It's right here. What's happening is that the cut itself is filling with sawdust, and then when it clears suddenly, that's when it lurches forward. So just be aware that that's a thing that happens. It happens more and more as the blade gets duller and duller. One way you can avoid it a little bit is to feed it very slowly, but you can't completely avoid it typically. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and do the top. I'm going to try to make a cut that varies just a little bit here. Remember that, though, that because this blade is as wide as it is from front to back, it doesn't want to make a nice sharp curve. It can only make really broad, gentle ones. So don't try to force it to do a thing that it doesn't want to do. It's a recipe for trouble. plate of the bandsaw. That was one of the things, of course, that keeps it, that binds it up a little bit. So between cuts, feel free to clear that out, okay? All right, so I'm probably gonna change this blade. It is starting to get pretty dull. You can see it initially burned a pretty fair bit. I might start by cleaning the blade and see if that doesn't help and extend its life that much further that way. It's not very cost effective for me to sharpen the blades. That was a thing that I did for a while, and now it's like, why would I do that to myself? So be aware if you're having difficulty pushing for whatever reason, it might be the blade. Just let me know, okay? All right, so I got the top. You can see it's got that little, see what I mean by helps keep it referenced end to end? I know exactly where this sits now because it has that small little bit of movement in it. All right, so I got my top and my bottom. There we go. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark and cut my sides according to the order of operations here. So in this case, see, I can already see how my marks come in handy. I could tell that one was facing the one way versus the other. So I'm going to just put this back on here for a second because this is so punky. I'm going to want to cut my side far enough over this way that it really isn't a problem, where I'm cutting that out. One thing that you also should keep in mind is that if you want to, you can cut shapes out of the inside. Like if your plan is that eventually the outside is going to be a shape and that you want the inside to reflect that, you can do that. You just have to make sure that you're not cutting the outside to that shape first. You can kind of plan for it, draw it on here so that you know what's happening, maybe cut it out of paper or whatever. So that is a thing, you just got to make sure that you're doing it in the right order. So I'm going to take about a 5/8 wall off of this side and more like 1 1/8 inches on this side. I'm just going to go with straight lines because why not? Now because this is so much narrower or like less deep of a cut, I'm just going to do that on the little bandsaw. And pretty much we're going to do little bandsaw from here on out. I just want to use the big one to do my tall cuts. If you don't need to use the big one, don't. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but you know, people tend to be, I don't know, a little overly enthusiastic about it maybe. Just, it's not that exciting of a tool. Sorry, Betty. All right, so. Okay, so now we are going to cut the sides off. And in this case, you know, same thing as before. Raise your guard. Now this is a variable height though, from one side to the other. So find what is roughly the highest point there and set to that. As long as the whole thing clears, that's really what's important. Open my guard, and I'm going to put on my gear. All the way over here. Before I do any more cutting, I need to do some more marking. Which will involve my pencil, which I'm sure I left over there. Thank you. So, like I said before, I need to know where these are going to mate up again. And it helps if I make different symbols in every corner here. So just span the one. I'm just going to make a couple of marks. And I mean, if you know where the inside is going to be, it's helpful to do this before you cut. I just am doing it after the fact and being careful about where everything is sitting. Because you can use it not just to reference in terms of like what goes where, but like very specifically, it should line up exactly at this point, kind of a thing. So somebody brought up yesterday, I think it was Kirsten, whether or not it matters if you stop in the middle of your cut or not.
Yeah.
When you're cutting something that is going to be a seam, like something that you're going to glue back together again, it actually does matter if you stop for too long in the cut. Because what will happen is that this tiny little hole is going to form between the two planes. So if I'm trying to glue them back together again and have it look seamless, that's not something that I want, naturally. Be aware when you start to cut things apart, and if you want them to really look as gorgeous as possible, you need to just keep moving. Is it important?
Oh yeah, tell them Martha suggests me 4 months.
Put it away. All right. All right, so this is what I have now for my marks. See that? Each one is completely different. I can tell what goes where, right? The thing of beauty. So from there, I'm going to want to give myself plenty of room to cut off my ends now. Remember what I was saying, that they should be roughly 1.5 inches, something like that. Even on something this size, I'm going to want them to be pretty hefty. Let's see. I'm just going to take these away now. Set those aside. And I'm just going to go straight across. Again, you can shape the interior pretty awesomely at this point if you want to. I'm not going to bother with that just yet. The other thing I'm going to do is so here's the marks that I've made for myself. Before I go any further, I'm also going to mark glue on the top of what is going to be my flange. It's really easy for the flange surface to get mixed up. So it just says glue, and it's a beautiful thing. Reminds me that this is the side I'm going to apply glue to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cut these. Flange for myself. So just gonna make a mark about 1/4 inch, 5/16 off of that surface there. And I'm gonna cut that. And I'm gonna do this one on the small bandsaw too, mostly because it's a little more maneuverable. And I don't need this giant blade for something as small as this, height-wise. Everybody see that? Yes? Excellent. So readjust my guard. And I'm going to make a nice small cut here. adjust my guard. Remember that, like, it might not seem like a big deal that it's an inch too high. You just don't want to mess with it, ultimately. All right. And I don't know that I'm going to use this divider, but it's nice to demonstrate what I'm looking for. All right, so I'll make that thinner. And then on this side, do one there, and I'll do one there. So this is what I've drawn on here. I put these little squiggly lines through the part that I don't want to cut, just to be on the safe side that I don't cut straight through it. But it will be this and this and this that I'm keeping that will be attached to each other. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make relief cuts that go in and straight back out again. I'm going to do that in the shortest dimension, and then I'll make long connecting cuts to that. So shortcuts first. Where I want it to, but also that I don't just cut straight through the thing that I'm trying to keep and into my thumb. Be gentle, be cautious. All right, so I'm going back over here. Okay, so in the tool room there is a box, a wooden box on the lower shelf when you go in on the right hand side that has all sorts of scrap sandpaper in it. You are welcome to it. It is there for you. My next step is going to involve a little bit of the scrap sandpaper. So maybe I'll raise that a bit. I start by completely reassembling my box. I'm going to get this guy in here, hopefully in the right direction. If it's not in the right direction, I can change that as necessary. Yep, it is, because the flange fits dead on there. And I want you to notice one thing in particular. Do you see how the sides now are narrower than the top and bottom? That's because I've lost one thickness of blade from both sides. I may have mentioned this before, but if I haven't, the thickness of one blade pass on anything is referred to as a kerf, K-E-R-F. So I have lost two kerf splits, making those two side cuts. So why is that important? You may be thinking to yourself, well, this shit doesn't line up anymore. It still does. Remember, the outside is the very last thing you're going to contend with. So if it's sitting like this, who cares? It's, you know, you don't need everything to be dead perfect at this point.
What I typically do is I push it to one side, just to kind of say, all right, well, most of that overhang is going to happen over here. If I need to line up something really critically, I can do it, you know, based off of one side or another. All right, so it's really helpful for me to know where everything is going to sit in relation to one another. And I'm going to mark the inside of the box to show me all of that. But in order to do it, you know, properly, I need to get rid of all the little fuzz that has occurred as the result of the bottom of the cut, right? It's pulling those fibers down. Here, you guys have all washed your hands. You can pass them around. You can see all the little fuzz that happens as a result of those cuts. I gotta get rid of that. I usually refer to that on here as like defuzzing or deburring my edges. So I take just a little piece of scrap paper of the sandpaper. This is 180 grit. You don't want it to be too aggressive. You're just trying to take the fuzz off. And you're gonna pick up your pieces and you're gonna look at the bottoms of the cuts. So this, for example. And you're just very lightly gonna take the fluff off. So I'm not putting pressure on it, I'm not trying to reshape anything, and I'm not trying to sand my surfaces. Do not sand your mating surfaces. Good Lord. For side grain, for the long cuts, there probably won't be much. But the thing is, if you glue this down and you haven't deburred it first, it can stick out into the seam and make it look really trashy. So instead of contending with that, we just get rid of the fuzz first. It's especially prominent when you're looking at where you've cut across the grain. So that's kind of the more important one. I mean, and you can see I'm trying really hard not to change this shape at all. I really am just trying to get that fuzz off. If I push too hard, I am going to start to reshape this, and that's no good. And I am not touching my glue surfaces at all. I know I already said that, but super important. All right, so that looks pretty good. Clear this off. Make sure there's not a lot of extra debris on the bottom. And I'm going to put these back on. Okay, once I've got that, I'm going to temporarily sort of clamp it closed with my hands. So I'm holding these nice and tight, and I'm going to trace the intersection of where they meet up. Both up the sides and around the bottom. This is going to show me where it's safe to put glue and where it isn't. I can also label those glue surfaces with a G. Like, this is where glue is going to go. You don't have to do that, but frankly, the more obvious it is what's happening with your object, the better. Because you are not going to have a lot of time to get the whole thing together. And in fact, this one I didn't quite mark all the way. There we go. Once I've got the bottom done, I am not going to put the flange in. Instead, what I'm going to do is Just get everything kind of arranged how I need it. I put the top on without the flange, and I flip the whole thing over. Take the bottom off and repeat, right? And that is going to tell me where the flange needs to live. And on this one, that's pretty important because I've got it really far off of center. At this point also, I will, you see that's messed up. This is the orientation that it goes in. I will indicate to myself that this end and this end are the ones that go together, with a little extra marking there. My flange also needs a little bit of love, and in fact probably needs more love than anything else does. The reason being is that this is that same width exactly as those pieces that I just, took out of here. What that means is that as a flange, it's probably too big. In fact, no probably about it. It's too big. You're not going to be able to force it on side to side, especially if you're going to put any kind of finish or paint on it. So one of the next most necessary steps is to make your flange a little narrower. And you can do that a number of ways. You can go to the disc sander and take a little bit off. You can go to the bandsaw and take another tiny little pass where you just kind of run this along the side of the blade. And it's like, meow. I personally really like to use the block plane, which is one of the tools that we're going to be talking more about specifically next class, when we do all of the hand shaping and stuff. But as it stands, the good key for you for this is, can you see that line that you made on both sides? Like pretty comfortably, not with a bunch of room, but like, does it fit within those lines? And right now, excuse me, mine doesn't. Very much does not. So what am I gonna do? I'm gonna do a super low tech thing. I'm gonna put it on the belt sander without turning on the belt sander. Look at that. There's some high-tech crap for you. If I were to have done that with the belt sander on, it would have taken away way too much material. But I had a nice flat reference surface, and it made it smaller. Looks like it still needs to be slightly smaller. One of the other things I'm doing is I'm beveling it in. So if this is the top and here's your flange, I want it to be widest right at the very top where it meets, and narrower inside, because what that does then is it goes in really easily and kind of tightens as it drops down. So if I hold it at an angle, I'm holding it at the angle that makes it so that it kind of keys in, okay?
So when you're narrowing it, is it best to do like one side, or do you do like both sides? Like,
I'm doing both sides,
okay.
Mostly so that I can angle both of them. If I don't want to angle them and I just want to leave them straight, I could do it from one side. I just personally like the symmetry of doing both. The likelihood of anything you mess up on one side being mirrored on the other seems intentional then, if that makes sense. All right, that actually, I think that's going to be good. If it isn't, there are ways of fixing it, and I'll be able to show you. But, all right, this pretty much now is ready for glue. So, that is a thing all unto itself. And let's go in the glue room and get ready to do it. All right, here we go. Let's talk about glue. Gluing is the most stressful part of woodworking ever. Oh my goodness. Which is so funny because you're like working with scary blades and shit. No. Gluing is where all of the fear comes in. The reason I say that is because you have a really limited time in which to get something assembled and under pressure. And if you go beyond that window, your glue seams are going to look terrible or potentially fail completely. But before we go into the drama of that, let's talk about the glue itself. We here in the shop use Titebond 3, which is this awesome polyvinyl acetate glue, PVA. It is slightly brown in color, as opposed to yellow glue, which has been the standard forever and ever. Titebond is pretty much what everybody uses. Titebond 3, in my opinion, is the best product they've come out with yet. If you need a bottle of glue and there are none sitting out, I want you to check underneath Ryan's butt there on the left-hand side. It says glue gallons, paint trays, and rollers. In the glue gallons cabinet, look at that. Titebond 3, the ultimate. I get this at Lowe's. It's good stuff. One thing that you're also going to want to be aware of is I have a gallon here too of Titebond 2, which is not standard yellow Titebond. This is a specific glue for a specific thing. Please don't use it. Okay? This is for veneering. It has an extended open time. Don't use it. It was expensive and I love it. All right. Titebond 3 though, I got lots of it. I got loads of gallons. Wrong drawer. Right drawer. So before I do any kind of gluing, I want to make sure that my bottle is full. If it is 3/4 of the way full, that's probably fine. If it starts being less than that, that can actually really be problematic while I'm trying to do the glue up, because I have a limited window of time. That limited window is 10 minutes. Glue has two different factors that you need to think about. One's called open time and the other one is cure time. Open time is the amount of time that the glue is viable before it starts to set. That's the amount of time you've got to actually execute whatever clamping needs to happen. Cure time or set time is how long it takes to set or cure. Actually, set time and cure time are two different things, but for our understanding, the set time is an hour. So once you get this under clamping pressure, you have an hour to wait before you can unclamp it, okay? In terms of cure time, how long before it's completely hard and unchangeable, that can be up to 3 days, but that's not critical for anything that we're gonna be doing. It's that 1 hour window that's really more important. So, that's actually why I make sure that my bottle is full. If I only have 10 minutes of open time to put my glue on, assemble it, and get clamps on it, I don't want to waste 4 of those minutes shaking the glue down to the end of the bottle. Make sense? I think so. So, I'm just trying to get rid of the gloop in the top here. What's up, gloop? Pop. So another note about Titebond 3, it is waterproof when dry. You can wash it out of your clothes while it's wet. You cannot after it has cured. So instead of running the risk of mucking up my clothing, unless it's like particularly trash clothing that I'm wearing that day, I put on this apron. There are 3 aprons available at any time here, so, but you can see that is why I'm doing this, is because I like these pants. It's really easy to walk into something and end up with glue on your pants and not even notice. So, come on, baby. Yeah. top to bottom. Variable 1 down. Don't have to worry about that. The glue is actually coming through the spout, variable number 2. I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to degunk it just a little bit though. Come on, baby. There we go. All right. So anytime you are going to do any kind of assembly involving glue and clamps, you need to do what's called a dry run. You need to do this. Some people are like, no, I don't. I can just do it. I can intuit this. It's fine. I'll just go along with it. You got 10 minutes. You don't know. Do a practice run. What that establishes for you is how many clamps you're going to need, if something wants to slide, all of that stuff. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to start by doing, a dry run. So here's a question. How many clamps do you think it's going to take for me to glue this and this together? If you had to venture guess. 2? 5? I'm going with at least 10, if not more than that. It's just going to depend. Let's talk a little bit about our clamps here though for a second. We have a whole variety of different kinds and sizes of clamps. The ones that you are going to use the most in here are this style. It's referred to as an F-style clamp, mostly because this can be adjusted into the letter F. Ooh, look at that. As opposed, of course, to a C clamp. I don't know why it's not called a G clamp, but this has a fixed throat. This does not. This has an adjustable throat. The strength of a clamp is determined by the thickness and width of the bar on the back. This essentially serves as a giant spring. So I can take something and put some pressure on it, and I'm able to do that because this bar is a particular size. Sorry, camera, that was awesome. Earthquake. So we have clamps made by primarily 2 different manufacturers. The ones over here are made by a company called Bessey, B-E-S-S-E-Y. They make some decent stuff. The ones that are over here, by and large, are made by a company called Wetzlar, and they are the best. Wetzlar clamp went out of business, though, a few years back, and so I ask that you be nice and gentle and kind to all of these, because I can't replace them, ultimately. Believe me, I've looked on eBay, and one clamp like that is like $50, which is crazy. Oh my God. But they are really well and truly the very best. So when I'm choosing what clamp to use, I'm going to choose based on kind of how much surface area I'm trying to close and how big my object is. This is a pretty small object that's not going to require a whole lot of clamping pressure, to be distributed over a large area. It's just, it's just not. So I'm going to probably go with these. They're lightweight. They don't require a whole lot of strength, and they also don't provide a whole lot of strength. But the cumulative effect of all of them is going to be exactly what I need. Make sure that when you are getting ready to do your clamping, that you have them backed off enough. If I were to, I'm going the wrong way. I'm so used to going the opposite direction here. If you start like this, you don't have hardly anywhere to go. So those 2 things that I was saying about the strength of your clamp, it's the size of this bar, but it's also how much available threading you have. You can only tighten it down so much if you only have this much threading to go. So make sure your clamps are backed off. Not all the way. You don't want the head to bind up. Make sure the head is able to toggle. But you want them to be, more like that. So, what am I looking at here? if I'm gonna glue this up, I'm gonna do it in 2 steps. I'm gonna start by gluing the sides to the ends. And that will fortunately only require 2 clamps. Grab another one over here. I'm just gonna grab a stack. So I'm gonna need them eventually anyway. Try my best to leave this open. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop this guy on here in the middle. I don't want it at the bottom, I want it at the top. I want my clamping pressure to be distributed across the joint. Right? So, 1. Come on, baby. And 2. So this is not perfect, but that's okay, because what's going to happen is once I've got this guy, hello, you gonna tighten up on me? Come on, darling. There we go. So this one is all lined up and in plane. This one is not. There's a little step right here. It's okay if that happens, because when you go to clamp this one down to the bottom, you can actually clamp them into plane with one another. So this would be considered glue up number 1. If I can get this done in 10 minutes, great. If I can get the whole thing done in 10 minutes, that's even better. But in theory, this is what I have to complete in one go, right? But then I'm gonna go ahead and glue it to meow. There's so much debris on this. I begin by clamping the ends. So I rotate the work so that an end is pointing at me. And I usually start, now that I have this together, I can rotate this up. Boom. And that opens up the room for this to get in here. I will do, come on you, one on one side here that goes across that joint to help pull it into plane, and one on the other side that does exactly the same thing. If I want to make sure that they really truly are in plane with one another, I can loosen this guy just a little bit so it's not clamping it closed. Do that. Clamp. In this case, I am going to move to the other end. When you're clamping something together, you gotta be really careful that you're not clamping more tension into the board than it already started with, right? You can, in theory, kind of like clamp a bunch of pressure into it if you start at both ends and work towards the middle. Frequently, what I do is I will clamp the whole thing up and then loosen everything ever so slightly to let the whole thing relax and then tighten them. Or you can work from one end to the other or from the center out. If you think about the tension like the water in a beach towel, if you are like, let's say you got your towel here and you're trying to wring it out, if you're wringing it out from the ends to the middle, all you're doing is pushing all the water to the middle, right? If you start from the middle to the ends, it actually has somewhere to go, or from one end to the other. Does that kind of make sense? The tension's the same way. But because the references are really important, I'm still going to do the ends first. What that means is that I have to do a little, just a little adjustment later. All right, now this one is off just a little bit, so I'm going to loosen this guy. Tell if I was actually loosening it. Tighten. Loosen you a little bit more. There, that guy's tight. That guy's tight. And that guy's tight. So that's 6 clamps. Now I need things holding down the edges here, right? I need clamping pressure opposite every glue surface. So, one. I'm gonna move this guy completely. It looks unhappy where it's living. And two. Come on, you. I know what I need to do. This guy's gotta move. There we go. And that, my friends, is why we do a dry run, is so I can see what issues I'm gonna run into before I actually have glue on here. There's one right there. And I'm just gonna grab one more that's long. It's all good. Ta-da! 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 10 clamps. So because it's going to take an hour for this to set, you can see the clamps are going to be a massive commodity, right? To that end, you need to label your glue up in terms of who you are, what time you glued it up, what day. Sometimes you walk away from these things. I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't leave things overnight, but you can. But there's a stack of paper over there. And in it, you know, all you got to do is say, Sarah Martin, Thursday, 10 a.m. or 10:11. So, or it can be unclamped at 11:11. You know what I'm saying? Because then you'll know if it's safe to unclamp, because it's just going to be a commodity like that. Work, if the table gets really too full to be useful, you can put the work down on the ground. Get it out of the way, right? But this is what you're looking at, all right? All right, I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting something. I'm sure I am, but it's gonna come to me as I am doing the actual glue up. So I'm gonna take the clamps off at this point, and I'm gonna actually do it.
So if you glue like the insert in after you finish screwing the first time, glue like insert divider.
I'm sorry?
The divider, do you glue it in like after you finish screwing?
I usually do,
Okay.
yeah. Just because it's one additional element that I don't wanna have to think about. Plus then if it like is skewed for any reason, I can like account for that too. Would you scoot my computer a little closer to this so that I can see what's up? Second. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So I have a glue brush. There are some sitting there. They are kind of jacked. I need to get some more. But you can use a paintbrush as well. Not a big deal, as long as you are rinsing it out really thoroughly before the glue dries. These are not these, because I got these from Harbor Freight and they suck. Most of the time your glue brushes can be almost endlessly reusable if you're using a water-based glue and you're being really thorough about washing them out. Regardless, here it is. It's just a flux brush, right? All right. One of the other things I'll do, or make sure of, is that everything is very clearly in plane with everything else, so I know where I'm going with it. Last little bit of detail before I start. When I put my glue on here, I don't go up to my line. I put glue on one surface, and I go up to about 1/4 of an inch from that line, because when I put clamping pressure on it, it's gonna squeeze into it. And if I have gone to the trouble of decorating the inside already, the way that like that other box was, if that glue squeezes out onto that surface, I got a problem, right? So I don't do that. I make sure that's one of the reasons I mark it, is so that I can get close to it, but not up to it, so that when it gets pressure put on it, it just squeezes into that blank spot. Make sense? All right. 1014. Put some glue on. I go from the inside to the outside like this to make sure that it doesn't accidentally go too far to the inside. And I am going all the way to the top and the bottom only because I can clean those surfaces off. Put this guy on here. I usually line up the inside, pivot down onto it, and give it a good press to keep it from wanting to slide. This side. You might be asking, how much glue is the right amount of glue? The answer is you want it to look like a very thinly glazed donut. Like you don't want it to look like it's frosted, you know? You should be able to see any writing that you have on there, and a little bit of the, you know, grain, but you shouldn't have it be so thin that it looks like it's starving to death. A little hard to describe, but when in doubt, too much glue is typically better than too little. A glue-starved joint can actually blow apart. One with too much glue mostly just makes a giant mess, and it, you know, complicates your cleanup time. And 2 minutes, although that just fell off. Nice. Oh, this one might be damaged. Regardless, because I have some bleed out on the bottom here, yeah, this one's no good. I'm gonna wanna go ahead and try to get it on the bottom right off the bat too, so that it counts as its own thing, even though I could stop at this point. So I'm gonna just put the glue on here. And same thing, I'm gonna start from the middle and work my way to the outside. I'm a little close to the line there. Trying to put a little bit on that side because it's not that wide. It's not the end of the world if you wipe something on the underside of the table. I'll forgive you. All right, set that on there, give it a little squeeze to keep it from sliding. I'm going to start in the middle this time. Admittedly, that's not how I did it last time. I'm living dangerously. I am going to get a better end result though, ultimately, by doing it this way. If I were you guys, I would start at the ends. It's just going to provide you with a little more control. The reason I'm doing it like this has more to do with getting everything stable before I mess with my ends, because I don't like exactly how they're sitting at the moment. So I'm just going to go up like that, get that out of the way, make sure it's still in the center. Over the one, that's the busted one, clamp over the other, thing. Clamp over the one. And the other. 10:20, 6 minutes. That took me a crazy long amount of time for how long this normally would take me. I usually can do an entire globe like this in 4 minutes, but I'm over caffeinated at the very least. But anyway, if you take a really good look inside here, you can see that there is just a little bit of glue squeeze out. It's these tiny, tiny, tiny little beads. That's okay. The tiny beads, awesome. Don't try to clean that up. The tiny beads are going to dry. I don't know that you're going to be able to see that at all. And pop right out. The problem comes if you've got like a big fillet, almost like a weld of glue all the way around something. That's going to be a lot more difficult to remove. So in that situation, I would recommend washing it out with like a toothbrush and some water and really drying it good. Got one more little glue demonstration to do, and then I'm going to show you one more thing, and then I'm going to let you go. Okay. So I still have to glue this guy down, right? There's a couple of things to remember about this, though. One is that I'm actually kind of doing some damage to my box here by gluing it the way that I am. I have my bare steel clamps sitting right on top of wet glue. And what happens when steel and wet things come into contact with each other? Rust. Exactly. I'm gonna leave behind a black rust stain on that surface everywhere where there is contact between the steel and the glue. Because this is such an organic process, I'm not too worried about it because very likely it's going to get covered with paint. Bandsaw boxes aren't typically super great to do with like a wood that you want it to like highlight because of the nature of how it's done. You know, you've got visible glue seams, all this other stuff. The likelihood is that whatever it is that you're working with, you're going to paint it or you're going to cover it in some other way. So I'm not too worried about it in this situation. I would be a little more worried about it here just because the compression issue that might happen is going to be hard to work out. You can get clamp marks out if the wood is just compressed a little bit and not broken by getting it super wet and then steaming it with an iron. Just like I'll take a super wet paper towel, put it over that surface, iron on high, it's going to force moisture back into those fibers and they're going to swell. It's an awesome thing. Now, the thing that really happens with this one that becomes a problem is that because this is so thin, comparatively speaking, when I get glue on this surface, that side expands. Just that side expands, and it turns into a potato chip. It goes whoop, and it sucks to try to, if I want to try to hold the entire thing down, I would need all sorts of clamps all the way around the outside. So instead, I have developed my very own method for dealing with this, which I'm extremely proud of, but it really works. In which I apply counter moisture. So if I'm getting glue on one side, I'm putting water on the other. And so as the one is expanding, the other is expanding too. The big problem with that, of course, is just keeping my, clamps from getting too rusty when I do that. So the way I do it is I take clamping cauls, which are in the drawer, also under Ryan's butt, and I use these guys both to distribute pressure across the whole thing and also to keep it from rusting the bejesus out of it. I think I actually need smaller ones here because this is so short. Normally what I would do is I would have something that, is just wide enough that I can kind of fit maybe 3 of them on there. And I'm also going to use bigger clamps. I'm going to use these guys. Excuse me for a moment. It's super overkill, super duper overkill. But going to distribute the pressure really broadly across this whole thing, and I'm not going to monopolize on my little ones either. And that's kind of a nice consideration. So I'm going to look for 2 slightly shorter backing pads here. We'll grab these just in case. I don't know if this is going to do the job either, but we'll see. Yeah. No. I really prefer it if it goes all the way across. We'll go with these 2. Okay. All right, so same idea. I'm going to put glue on the flange surface. And same thing, I'm not going to go right up to the edge. I'm going to go close to the edge with the expectation that it's going to bleed to the outside. Have a little too much glue, but that's okay. I'm going to pick it up with my brush and just sort of set the brush aside for the moment. Get this guy on here. I'm going to push a little, and I have a little more squeeze out already than I did last time. But now, before I do anything else, I'm just going to work some moisture into this surface. I'm not trying to get it super wet. I just want to get it wet enough that it's going to compete with the other side for expansion. Then, get that guy out of there. Right in the middle. And I'm looking to make sure it doesn't twist as I tighten. That is more likely to happen with a clamp this size, because it's just got so much power by comparison. Gorgeous. There it is. Ta-da! So I'm just gonna quick rinse out my brush. It really probably needs washing, but anyway. All right, so after an hour, you can take these out of clamps. I would ask that you wait for 3 hours before you start doing any machine work on them again, because it might need it. Not might need it, what am I saying? It will need it. In order to finish this off, you need to then address the outside. Oh look, it's this box that I made last semester. Heaven forbid, look, I made it last semester. It's exactly the same, only much bigger. But now that everything is glued up, everything is dry, now is when we cut out the outside. So, your handout is going to have all of this information in it. Like I said, just follow the directions, follow the directions, follow the directions. In order to get the new exterior that I'm looking for, I'm going to start by taking the lid off. And I'm going to cut this with the lid off. The reason being that I want to make sure that I'm not cutting into the box. Dear God, it sucks when you're like, I'm going to cut a shape into it, and then you like cut all the way into it. It's very, very sad. So you're going to avoid that by starting by redefining its exterior plane with the lid off so you can see all of it. It's awesome. So I'm just going to trim it a little bit. Maybe I'll do something on the ends to make it more interesting, but it's not, I don't have a huge amount of room here to play, so I'm just going to take a little tiny bit off. You'll notice too how I have my hands, I'm going to have them all the way over on this side. Because I'm going to be removing such a small amount of material here, I want to make sure that my hands are nowhere near this if it has the ability to kind of pop out of the cut. And it does, you know. It's going to try to follow the path of least resistance.
planes are now totally lined up with one another. So I didn't get any offset, any of that. It looks good. Yeah. So once I do that, and I know that I've got plenty of room, I put the lid back on, and I cut it again. Only this time, I really need to fit that lid more, but I'm not going to worry about it at the moment. Come back over, raise my blade, or raise my guard, and I'm essentially just going to trace what I just did. I am, however, noticing that my side-to-side guides here are not quite in the right place, so I'm going to quick fix that so that they don't drift as much. And it's okay if you throw your strap on the floor, you just have to clean up. Like, setting it here means, you know, potentially it falling into the machine. Oh, hello. Come on, baby. I gotta be like that. Okay. I still don't like that, but slightly better. At least the spacing is symmetrical now. All right, now I'm gonna trace. Again, watch where my hand placement is. It was touching on one side and not the other, and I had to kind of move in a little closer to the blade to get it to do what I wanted. The reason is that these aren't flat anymore because wood moves. Look at the gap for the lid there. See that? This surface is arced. So when I set it down and I try to get good contact, it doesn't mean that it's going to be 90 degrees perfectly to the blade anymore. So I just work with it, right? And frankly, I can do more shaping now that I've got this all cleaned up. But like this all by itself, this is the extent of where your sample box needs to be a week from today. Just follow the steps in the handout. Since most of you guys are going to be getting checked out today anyway, I'll have handouts for you ready to go, okay? That you'll be able to follow along. But that's it right there. Do you guys have any questions about this process? So what's going to happen is you're going to make your sample box, which is going to give you the opportunity to F it up in a low stakes fashion. And then, once you feel like, well, even if you don't feel like you've got that process, we're going to be doing a bigger assignment based on this construction method. Doesn't necessarily have to be a box, but with the idea being that you know how to cut things apart and put them back together again, following those gluing rules.
And that is going to take us through almost the first half of the semester, just because of, well, just because it will, you know. It'll give you 4 or 5 weeks to work on it. You know, but I'm expecting ambitious projects as a result, or multiples of something small. I'll talk about the specifics of the assignment on Tuesday. You don't need to worry about it until then. Just get yourselves checked out. Oh, and then the codes. Once you are fully checked out, you will be able to come in here and work independently. That does not mean that the wood room will be open. You need to make sure you're getting your wood when I am around. Or you know, try to make sure that it's unlocked at the very least. But the codes to get in, the outside doors, both this one and this one, is 058. If you're having a hard time opening it for whatever reason, there's a reset button on it. Just click reset, 058. In order to put those little things back on, you have to open it again, unlock it so that it'll, you know, whatever. So just punch it in again, and that's going to allow you to close the whole thing. The tool room combination is 0250. And that is all of the combinations you need. So just remember, you must have a partner. Ash has posted their monitor hours in which they'll be available to be your partner, essentially. But yeah, I want a finished sample box by this time Thursday. Actually, by the beginning of class Thursday, not the end. Questions?
Where are hours listed?
On the door.
Oh.
On both doors, actually. Yeah. Other questions? All right, it's 10:38, or yes, it's 10:38. You are free to go. Thank you so much, you guys.